Unlike Sunday, there's a few people sitting in the first 6 rows. If this were Sunday, everyone would be in the back 6. But welcome, everyone. My name is Brian. I'm the rector here at St. Christopher's. And I'd like to just welcome all of you here and thank you for coming. As we all know, the climate emergency is something that is pressing and demands all of our attention and action. So I'm welcoming you on behalf of St. Christopher's Church and its Earth Honoring Faith Committee. And that is a committee that, through education and advocacy and sharing best practices, tries to make our Earth a healthier, a more sustainable place. I'd also like to speak out on the Faith Communities Environmental Network. That is 40 or so faith communities on the Cape working for eco-justice, again through advocacy, education, and the sharing of best practices. And that organization is connected to yet another organization, and that is the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative, which will host, by the way, a forum on Monday with Bill McKibben. And he will be at Barnstable High School, and it's free and open to the public, so you can see that on the internet. And lastly, I'd like to welcome those who represent the Chatham and Energy and Climate Action Group. I think all these organizations and Sierra, and more on Sierra in a minute, and others working together are really what we need to transform what's happening to this fragile Earth, our island home. So I want to thank all of those organizations and really all of you for your interest and your attention to this. That said, it's my honor to welcome and introduce Ross McFarland. We had a special relationship with his agent here in Chatham, who happens to be his mother-in-law, so probably the only way we could get him here. As you know, Ross lives in Seattle. So I think it bears me reading his bio because it's quite impressive. Ross McFarland is a climate and clean energy advocate based in Seattle, Washington. He serves on the National Board for Sierra Club, where he chairs Conservation Policy Committee and was vice president for conservation from 2020 through 2022. Ross is secretary for the Clean Energy Transition Institute and a founding member of the advisory board for Western Washington University's Institute for Energy Studies, where he taught a course on clean energy and climate. Ross was senior advisor at Climate Solutions, where he advocated for strong climate policy and led its work on sustainable aviation fuels. Before that, Ross managed environmental and legal matters for a transit agency, practiced environmental law as a partner at a major law firm, K&L Gates, and enforced pollution control laws at the US EPA. A passionate hiker, climber, skier, and sea kayaker, Ross draws inspiration from wild places in his native Northwest, visiting family on Cape Cod and around the world. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ross.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Brian. After an intro like that, it always goes downhill. But I really want to start by thanking Brian, the Earth Honoring Faith Committee at St. Christopher's, the Faith Communities Environmental Network, and the Massachusetts chapter and Cape Cod and Islands group of the Sierra Club, who are all hosts for us here today. Brian already outed me for the special relationship with Chatham. When they asked if there was any possible way you could do this in Chatham, I go, of course. You know, I love to come to Chatham. I love to visit Peggy. I love to hear the sound of my own voice, and so this is perfect. And, you know, in addition to Peggy being the mother of my wonderful partner, love of my life, Lisa, who's here today, as well as to my brother-in-law, Bill, and his wife, Dar, who are here today. You know, I need to thank Peggy and all of the folks who are part of the Earth Honoring Faith Committee, as well as I understand Susan Starkey and the rest of the group at FCEN. You've really done amazing work to build understanding and catalyze action on the climate crisis. I've been so impressed. Peggy's been sharing clips and some videos and things about the climate forums you did. Our daughter actually helped Peggy learn how to do Zoom so that she could keep the meetings going during that great pandemic time. And it's just been really great to see how the work you've been doing to make your church, your community, more energy efficient, more sustainable, and less dependent on fossil fuels. Really inspiring. You know, I confess I'm a little intimidated here. I do a lot of public speaking. Normally I use the crutch of a PowerPoint, and I decided rock it old school since I was here in a church. And also, I've got a lot of family members here. I don't usually have that. But I'm also intimidated being here in a church, not at the big pulpit, but still surrounded by so many great people, many from faith communities. You know, I'm not churchy myself. I'm a lapsed Unitarian whose glimpses of the sacred typically happen outdoors, whether climbing a mountain, surrounded in a forest, kayaking on water. But I really honor and respect what so many of you have been doing. Without leadership of people from the faith communities, we have no hope to confront the climate crisis or any other major challenges that we face. A recent Pew study confirmed what I think we all know, is that folks who belong to religious communities are more engaged and active citizens, and you are all living proof of that truth. Briefly, I'm inspired by the Episcopal Church's statement on creation care. It goes, "For God's sake, we will adopt practical ways of reducing our climate impact, living more humbly and gently on the earth as individuals, households, congregations, institutions, and dioceses. For God's sake, standing along marginalized people, we will advocate and act to repair creation and seek the liberation and flourishing of all people." It's a great statement. And a deep reverence and commitment for all of God's creation is shared by leaders from so many different traditions. You know, I just saw that Pope Francis is going to be following up his famous and really eloquent papal bull, Laudato Si, later this summer, with a specific demand that people stand with victims of environmental and climate injustice and put an end to the senseless war against creation. Put an end to the senseless war against creation. I think that's really powerful. And as you know, those kind of calls are mirrored by leaders from every creed: Protestant, Jewish, Quaker, Buddhist, Muslim, and of course especially from the spiritual tradition of the people that we inherited this land from, the people, indigenous people who stewarded our continent for many, many millennia, and who believe that we need to judge our actions by asking what our impact will be on our ancestors 7 generations in the future. You know, sadly, there are some today who use religion to justify exploitation, pollution, and waste, a school of thought that is sometimes called dominion theology. As one preacher put it, God intended us to use this planet, to fill this planet for the benefit of man. Never was it intended to be a permanent planet. It is a disposable planet. A disposable planet. You know, I've already confessed I'm no theologian, but it's impossible for me to imagine that this earth, with all of its wondrous creatures, intricate habitats, and the diverse and vibrant cultures, was created for disposal and destruction. So I honor and respect all of you who are committed to building and stewarding the future that we need, where all humans and living creatures can thrive. So I assume with all the work you've been doing, none of you need a primer on climate science or the reasons we need urgent action. Since we're gathered here on Cape Cod, jutting way out into the Atlantic on World Oceans Day, however, I thought it was worth remembering that our oceans, our shorelines, and our coastal habitats are facing some of the worst impacts from the climate crisis. Sea level rise, intensifying storms, ocean acidification, bleaching of coral reefs, declining oxygen levels, saltwater intrusions, and changes to the currents that drive our weather. The oceans are essentially the batteries in our climate systems. And while surface temperatures are fluctuating based on all sorts of weather, seasonal oscillations, the oceans steadily accumulate the excess heat that's trapped by carbon dioxide and methane and the other global warming gases. According to the nonprofit Ocean Visions, the excess heat absorbed by the ocean is equivalent to 5 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs of heat energy going into the ocean every second. Every second. That's a pretty stunning statistic. Ocean temperatures have already risen by more than 1.5 centigrade since the start of the last century, and scientists are predicting much more records this year as another El Nino cycle kicks in and drives global weather. And I also can't pass by another climate elephant in the room this week, the eerie smoke from Canadian wildfires that is shrouding our communities and triggering health warnings all along much of the eastern seaboard. This has become a yearly occurrence out west where I live, and it has totally transformed our experience of summer. I had a friend who had lived with me growing up in the Northwest and moved back east and brought her daughters out, and one of them was saying, "Mom, what did you do when you were growing up? And you had to play inside because of all that smoke. What did you do?" And you know, she had to say, "Dear, it was never that way. We never had to do those things. Growing up, we worried about rain and not smoke when we were planning picnics, weddings, or other kinds of events. The last few years have been totally different. Obviously, forests burn, and it happens every year, but the number and size of fires and the length of the fire season is completely unprecedented. And scientists are clear that there's a link between that and the heat and drought that comes from global warming. Breathing smoke from fossil-fueled forest fires is fortunately a passing phenomenon for us, even though it can cause permanent damage to many people's health. But it also gives us a more vivid sense of the kinds of impacts that too many people around the world are experiencing in places like Delhi, Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities where experiencing breathing soot from coal and oil combustion is a daily threat to their healths. Around the world, approximately 1 out of 5 deaths result directly from fossil fuel pollution, mostly soot pollution. And this staggering total actually rises to 1 out of 3 deaths in Asia. So the smoke we are breathing this week should be a reminder to us that it isn't just about climate change. It's about really specific impacts that we're all experiencing and that we need to act with urgency to end the fossil fuel age and embrace clean energy. So you all know that while the roots of the climate crisis are really complex, the overwhelming driver does involve our extraction and burning of fossil fuels. Humanity's discovery of the energy locked up in deposits left by ancient forests and swamps has been the key to global prosperity on a scale that was unimaginable to our ancestors. It has also placed us, in the words of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, on a highway to climate hell, with our foot still on the accelerator. Any prospects for the survival of organized human civilization or survival of the species who we share this earth with will depend on our getting our foot off the gas pedal and replacing fossil fuels with cleaner alternatives in the next several decades. Finally, I think you all know that we can't solve the climate crisis in a vacuum. We face crises of collapsing biodiversity, spiraling inequity, and threats to our democracy, just to mention a few of the most important ones. We need solutions that will actually be intersectional and help address all of these crises. Pretty bleak, right? But since we're gathered here in a church today, let's share the good news. First, we have solutions today that can replace fossil fuels and power our lives to make them that are more affordable, less polluting, and better for our communities. You know, that fact is pretty remarkable. When Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the White House back in the 1970s, they produced electricity at hundreds of times the cost of the oil and coal that they were replacing. Solar and wind today outcompete fossil fuels in most of the world, even without subsidies, and without accounting for the horrific costs that fossil fuels impose on our communities and on our planet. And the cost of renewable energy just keeps plummeting. More good news. We're finally starting to build a movement with the breadth, the scale, and the intensity to go toe-to-toe with the world's richest and most powerful industry. Fossil fuel companies pour billions of dollars each year and armies of lobbyists into protecting the status quo. It's really profitable for them. On the other side, we have mostly people power. But increasingly, us naive activists who've had the audacity to even enter the field against such overwhelming opposition have been winning. You know, take, for example, Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign. Working with a multitude of partner organizations and frontline communities and thousands of activists, we succeeded in something that seemed impossible. Quixotic, actually, when we began, stopping the coal industry in its tracks in the United States. When we started this whole campaign, industry executives were trumpeting a global coal supercycle. Stock prices for mining companies were soaring. Today, most of those companies have gone bankrupt, many of them several times. No new plants have been built since we started the campaign. And more than 2/3 of the existing plants have been shut down or scheduled for retirement, just in the last decade. Our movement stopped the Keystone XL pipeline. We prevented drilling in the Arctic Ocean. Thank you, thank you. And we've won lots of other very important battles. We are by no means winning all of our battles. The recent setbacks around the Willow Project in Alaska and the Mountain Valley Pipeline are bitter reminders of that fact. But we put the fossil fuel industry and its investors on notice that the age of easy expansion is over and that its future prospects are definitely limited. Even more importantly, we've begun to amass political power that allows us to enact good policies that promote renewable energy and environmental justice and accelerate the transition from fossil fuels. We did this first at the state level in states around the country like California, Washington, Illinois, New York, Minnesota, and right here in Massachusetts, which have all adopted very sweeping legislation to address the climate crisis and promote solutions. But even more importantly, we finally convinced Congress to pass the first major piece of climate legislation in U.S. history last summer. Make no mistake, there were major compromises in that bill. Harmful concessions to oil and gas and other dirty industries. Nevertheless, this legislation was unprecedented. The bill gives major incentives for renewable energy and clean technologies that will be critical to accelerate their implementation. When we were advocating for this act, groups like Sierra Club predicted that it would unleash massive investments in renewable energy and other clean technologies. And that's exactly what's been happening. The Wall Street Journal recently predicted that these policies would unlock $3 trillion, that's trillion with a T, $3 trillion in spending for green energy projects just over the next decade. This investment surge is creating thousands of new projects and tens and hundreds of thousands of new jobs. And most of them are actually happening in red states and rural communities. For those of us who've been pushing Sisyphus's rock up a steep hill for decades, these policies have completely shifted the landscape of what's possible and really opened up a new era. So we're winning, right? There's no question that the global economy is moving in the right direction now, and that the trends are all towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. But unfortunately, the climate clock is ticking, and as the great climate author Bill McKibben reminds us, winning slowly is the same thing as losing. By the way, you guys all go to Hyannis on Monday and see Bill McKibben because he's awesome. So meeting this challenge at the speed and scale needed is truly daunting. Scientists estimate that we need to cut climate pollution in half by the end of this decade. That's in 7 years, 6.5, I guess, actually now. The incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act are actually sufficient, most analysts say, to get us most of the way towards meeting our climate targets, but only if we can radically step up the pace of deploying renewables and other clean technologies. Which brings me finally to the core of today's talk. You were wondering if I was going to get to the point, weren't you? Meeting this challenge is going to require climate activists to focus on two things and learn some new tricks. First, we need to continue what we've been doing and continue stopping bad things, things like pipelines, liquefied natural gas terminals, fracked oil, and coal mines. And we need to work to phase out fossil fuels in our communities. You all know the first rule of holes, right? When you're in one, stop digging. And our efforts to keep the fossil fuel industry from continuing to make that hole deeper are going to be critical to our success. So we have to keep doing that and proudly doing that. And when our opponents accuse us of being NIMBYs when we oppose those kind of projects, we should just proudly say that our principle is NOPE, standing for not on planet Earth, as opposed to NIMBYs, meaning not in my backyard opponents. But second, we need to learn how to be good advocates for needed clean energy projects and not just policies. Projects that are critical to deploying clean technologies that will displace fossil fuels and give us a shot at a sustainable future. While we're standing up against fossil fuels and polluting infrastructure, we also need to stand up for the kinds of development that we need for a cleaner energy. We need to tilt for wind turbines, for solar panels, for energy storage facilities, and for the transmission lines that are needed to connect that renewable energy to the cities and other load centers where it's needed. We need to stand up for housing, for transit, for urban infill that will curb sprawl and cut transportation emissions. And we need to be proudly YIMBYs who say, yes, especially in my backyard, for that kind of development when it comes to building renewable energy and clean infrastructure at the speed and scale that we need to really address the climate crisis. Our challenge in a nutshell is that we environmentalists have been better at saying no than embracing a yes. Our core competency has been stopping projects and preventing development. Many of the proudest moments in Sierra Club's history, for example, involve courageous fights to prevent harmful development, dating all the way back to John Muir's unsuccessful but heroic effort to keep the Hetch Hetchy Valley, the second Yosemite, from being flooded to provide water for San Francisco, through stopping dams that were going to be flooding the Grand Canyon, and protecting countless wilderness areas and other really critical places from development. And then up through our current efforts, stopping pipelines, fracking, oil and gas, and other dirty projects. As I said before, this is critical. We have to keep doing that. But we also have ingrained habits that make it easier for most environmentalists to be opponents than allies for project developers. We tend to look at profit-driven companies with suspicion, an attitude which they frankly earned over the years. We are comfortable with long, drawn-out processes and know that delay is our friend when we're trying to stop development. We tend to resist change and demand perfection and oppose projects if they're going to have any impacts on the beloved places that we care about the most. For us, it's a lot easier generally to love renewables in the abstract. For example, when we're marching and carrying signs or advocating for pro-renewable policies in state legislatures and Congress, than it is to actually embrace real projects that are made out of steel and concrete and being put in place by bulldozers, and being built on our farms and forests and marine vistas. It's easier to march for a clean energy future than it is to hug a transmission tower or a giant wind turbine. And let's be clear, renewable energy projects and renewable energy project developers need our love. This may seem odd since these are big companies, often backed by Wall Street, with all that money I talked about under the Inflation Reduction Act coming in. But while we have passed policies to boost clean energy at the state and federal level, our success in meeting climate targets will depend entirely on how fast these projects get built. The speed and scale of what we need to build in the next few critical years is daunting, to say the least. We not only need to replace coal and natural gas on the electric grid with clean power, we need to use clean electrons to replace fossil gas and petroleum in our transportation system, powering all our trucks and cars, to heat our buildings, and to repower industry. According to Princeton professor Jesse Jenkins, that's going to require us to build as much new clean energy generation by 2035 as the entire generating system that we have today. And then we have to do that again between 2035 and 2050. That's a lot. And doing this is also going to require large utility scale projects. Putting solar on rooftops, doubling down on energy efficiency, the kind of things you've done here are incredibly important. We need to do a lot more of that and eliminate obstacles to doing that. But every study that has been done to forecast a future with net zero climate pollution shows we're going to need to radically accelerate deployment of all kinds of wind, solar, and renewable energy, including very large utility scale projects, along with a lot more transmission and energy storage projects to make this all work so that people can get in the power they need on a 24/7 basis. Again, Princeton professor Jesse Jenkins estimates that 80% of the climate reduction benefits that are promised in the Inflation Reduction Act will be lost if we don't dramatically speed up the deployment of transmission. Similarly, meeting our targets will require getting a lot of big renewable projects built quickly. Small is indeed beautiful, but we need big projects too, which inevitably will come with impacts and disruption. The fossil fuel industry is not conceding power easily, and it knows that building renewable energy and clean infrastructure is a major hurdle for the energy transition. It's pouring millions of dollars into hundreds of local groups that are rallying in many places to block renewable energy development and spreading misinformation and fear about the harms that will occur. They're also funneling contributions to state and local politicians who are enacting laws in many places that make it a lot harder or even impossible to site renewable energy projects. According to Columbia University's Sabine Center for Climate Change Law, renewable energy proponents have mobilized in the last several years to block renewable projects in 49 out of 50 states and have successfully passed restrictive laws or ordinances in 31 states. So this backlash is affecting renewable energy projects and clean infrastructure of every type in every location, as well as the transmission lines and energy storage facilities that we're going to be needing for a 100% clean future. So groups are protesting solar farms in the desert, wind energy in the plains, and transmission lines everywhere. But since we're here on Cape Cod, I thought we would focus on offshore wind. You know, Senator Markey has called the area near here, off Massachusetts' coast and off Cape Cod, the Saudi Arabia of wind. So let's focus on the threats that we're seeing to that development. As I think you all know, the waters here are really ideal for offshore wind development with the right combination of steady breezes and also shallow seas. And with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, there are billions of dollars of investment money flowing in to make those projects a reality here and up and down the East Coast. The federal government, as well as nonprofits like the Sierra Club, have all identified these projects critical if we're going to actually move beyond coal, oil, and gas and have a clean energy economy. As you know, there's a long and tortured history for developing these resources. My nephew, Boone, Peggy's grandson, worked on the first major offshore project in the country, Cape Wind, which finally folded after decades of opposition from the owners of coastal mansions who were concerned about their views as well as other claimed impacts, most notably Senator Ted Kennedy. The conservative magazine National Review used this example to support its claim that wealthy progressives love wind power, except when it is near them. Ouch. With the new surge of development unlocked by the Inflation Reduction Act, opponents have been using environmental arguments against offshore wind. Most prominently, they've been spreading false claims that exploration work for these offshore wind developments is responsible for whale deaths. Let's be clear. There is no credible evidence linking wind development, which has barely even really started on the East Coast, with increased whale mortality. According to NOAA, at this point, there is no evidence to support speculation that noise resulting from wind development could potentially cause mortality of whales, and no specific links between large recent whale mortalities and current ongoing surveys. The fact that this claim has no basis in reality hasn't stopped it from being trumpeted widely on social media, articles, and even featured on cable news shows by the likes of Tucker Carlson. As Mark Twain reportedly said, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still getting on its shoes. Although much of the opposition appears to be grassroots and locally based, there are well-funded groups that amplify and unify all these efforts. As reported by the Center for American Progress, the various organizations, news outlets, and elected representatives that have been promoting this misinformation about offshore wind have two things in common: conservative politics and ties to the oil industry. The notorious climate denier organization, the Heartland Institute, I don't know how many of you remember when they put up billboards linking belief in climate science with lovable characters like Charles Manson, Fidel Castro, the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski. That Heartland Institute has rebranded itself in the cause of saving the whales. Another group with a green, friendly name, the American Coalition for Ocean Protection, spreads information about the supposed environmental harms of offshore wind and litigates against projects. Recent investigations showed that, surprise, surprise, this group is funded by Koch Industries and a coalition of oil and gas companies. Similar funding and efforts link many other groups opposing offshore wind and other renewable energy development around the country. You know, there was a great project by a group of students recently at Brown University that was cataloging the different kinds of misinformation tactics that were being used by anti-offshore wind groups, calling them discourses of climate delay. Some of the common approaches that groups use to try to convince climate and environmental justice advocates that offshore wind is bad include things like policy perfectionism, where opponents emphasize the downsides of a technology without comparing it to what the alternatives are. Blow fishing, that's where an inconsequential small part of some research is blown all out of proportion and taken out of context with what the experts might believe. Cherry picking data, relying on fake experts, often ones that have shown up in asbestos litigation or other kinds of litigation before but are now experts on whales, and conspiracy theories claiming that only foreign companies and shadowy figures will be benefiting from these projects. So as we all know, this kind of information is all too common, and it easily goes viral in social networks, conservative media, and coastal communities. These claims linking offshore wind to whale deaths have gotten huge traction, despite the fact that they have no basis in fact. As I noted earlier, there's no evidence that these claims are true, and plenty of evidence that whales are dying from ship strikes, changing food chains and availability of food related to global warming, and continued threats to the marine ecosystem, all of which can be linked to our continued reliance on fossil fuels. So that's offshore wind. You can see similar examples in every other part of the country too, and with every other form of renewable energy development. For these reasons, we are unlikely to be able to develop clean energy and infrastructure at the speed and scale that's needed without active support from climate and environmental advocates. We need to couple our no's with strong and clear yeses. Now, I need to be clear about two things. First, support doesn't mean unquestioned acceptance. Like any form of development, offshore wind, other renewable energy technologies have real impacts, and the turbines, transmission lines, shoreside facilities need to be properly sited and designed to minimize those impacts and minimize the harm to local communities and the environment. Some projects are going to get proposed in places and designed in ways that have unacceptable impacts, and we can and should oppose those or work to make sure that they're changed in ways to allow them to be acceptable. The climate crisis is happening at the same time that we have an extinction and biodiversity crisis. And we need to steer development away from areas that are critical for the conservation of endangered species. Sierra Club has made conservation and work on the extinction crisis, including our work on the 30 by 30 initiative, an effort to protect 30% of our conservation lands by the year 2030, one of our top priorities along with our work on climate. We also need to be especially vigilant to ensure that development doesn't harm environmental justice communities. And we need to address and ensure, be vigilant to the kinds of energy development that follow well-worn paths of exploiting poor, minority, or indigenous communities. Too often, utilities and other energy companies in the past have viewed these communities as lacking political power and viewed development through these communities as being the paths of least resistance. And that's something that we all need to be focused on. Sierra Club, for example, has proudly joined tribal nations in opposing development on sacred lands, sacred to those tribes, and opposed a solar farm that was proposed by a utility in Florida that was going to be smack in the middle of one of the only communities in Florida or the nation that was still owned by black landowners. And, you know, I'm proud of that work. And those environmental justice concerns should actually make all of us who are privileged to live in the wealthier communities, places that have more political power, even more enthusiastic about welcoming renewable energy into our backyards. We also need to support planning efforts to identify the best places to put renewable energy in transmission and help developers know in advance where the no-go areas are, as well as where there are better places to site their projects. We've worked on a lot of regional planning efforts around the country and are currently working on some internal guidance to help Sierra Club leaders and the folks we work with evaluate those issues on a case-by-case basis. So support never equals unquestioned acceptance. But I argue that we need to have an overall stance of support and leaning into these projects and building strong partnerships with the clean energy business leaders so that we can ensure that they're getting things done as needed. We need to evaluate any impacts from renewable energy development in the context of the enormous harm that our continued addiction to fossil fuels is causing every day to every living creature on this planet. In short, we need to be strong advocates for getting cleaner energy projects built at the speed and scale that the climate crisis demands. Second, I need to be clear that I'm not advocating for or excusing efforts to gut bedrock environmental laws, like the National Environmental Policy Act, or the kinds of permit reforms that would also greenlight pipelines and other dirty energy projects. These approaches have been much in the news in the last while. I'm sure you read about some of the policies that were jammed into the debt ceiling bill, and which Sierra Club and other groups opposed. We do need more funding for federal agencies so that they can actually review and approve projects and go through the process in a quicker way, complete environmental reviews. And we should eliminate some current disparities that actually make it far easier for someone to cite a natural gas or an oil pipeline in this country than to build electricity transmission from a renewable energy project. But NEPA is a critical tool for environmental justice. It ensures that the voices of frontline communities can be heard during project development. And research also doesn't support any claims that NEPA is the big obstacle and the biggest cause for permit delays. In most cases, the biggest obstacles are local permits and local community opposition and what's happening at the state and local level. So what can we do? First, keep doing what you're doing. Continue to educate yourselves and your communities about the climate crisis and needed solutions. Hugely honor what you've been doing. Counter lies and misinformation that fossil fuel companies and dark money groups are planning to try to slow the transition to clean energy. Speak out publicly on behalf of needed development. Sierra Club's Massachusetts chapter has some great information on our website about the benefits of offshore wind, for example. And our New Jersey chapter is actually holding a rally this coming Saturday, day after tomorrow, to support offshore wind development and push back on the lies from some of the opponent groups. You can find a lot more great information from other groups. The Audubon Society, for example, has worked both to ensure that wind turbines are built responsibly in ways that are safer for birds, while also pointing out that we need renewable energy and clean energy projects to save birds and every other species on this planet. Second, arm yourself and share information about the horrific harms that our addiction to fossil fuels is creating every day. This includes the climate crisis, of course, but it also includes the environmental and health issues that people face every day from the pollution caused by the production, extraction, and burning of oil, gas, and coal, like those impacts on health that we talked about earlier, the deaths from soot that are happening every day around the world. We need to minimize impacts from the clean energy transition, especially on those vulnerable and frontline communities, but we should never lose sight of the huge harm that's being created by every day that transition is delayed. Third, we need to continue to demand policies and investments from our elected leaders to spur the clean energy transition. After I finish, I'm going to ask Chris Powicki, the chair of Sierra Club's Cape Cod and Islands Group, to talk about a specific way that you all can be encouraging your towns and communities to demand that they include offshore wind in their power purchases. Specifically, I'll talk to you about ways you can urge local leaders to call on the Cape Light Compact, the municipal aggregation serving more than 200,000 customers on the Cape and Vineyard, to incorporate offshore wind in their future supply mix. That's one concrete way that you can really make a difference to support offshore wind. Finally, I hope you'll get more active with and consider supporting groups like the Sierra Club to accelerate climate action, environmental justice, and renewable energy. Now, there's lots of great groups out there. I belong to many of them. And all nonprofit groups depend on the time, talent, and treasure of the folks who support us. I'm obviously partial to the Sierra Club. We're the nation's oldest, largest, and I believe most effective grassroots group focused on climate action and environmental justice. We're unique also in the extent to which we depend on volunteer leaders, folks like Chris and me, who actually get involved in plotting our strategies and making real change happen. Chris is a great example of that kind of leadership on a local level. We have fabulous staff, but we don't depend on them. The staff get to leverage the power of the volunteers. I'm very proud of the way that our volunteers and staff show up every day and work to ensure a better future for our kids and grandkids. We brought some literature and donation materials in the back, and Chris and I are happy to answer any questions if you're interested in learning more about Sierra Club. You know, in conclusion, the climate crisis really is the defining challenge for our age. We're already experiencing major impacts from our fossil fuel addiction, but we have the solutions that will allow us to build healthier communities and to really address this crisis. But it's up to us to ensure that we are implementing those solutions at the speed and scale that we need. You know, many folks have compared our moment to World War II, when the greatest generation transformed our entire economy in lightning speed to counter an existential threat. Others have talked about this as an Apollo moment, when we came together with innovation, commitment, and funding to achieve a goal that people thought completely impossible when President John F. Kennedy first announced it. That's a great analogy too, and it also reminds us of the first time that we actually could see this precious tiny Earth, covered mostly in water, barely protected by a paper-thin atmosphere from outer space. Our visit to the moon was optional, though, and we don't have any choice about taking this action on climate. For that reason, I sometimes think that we should compare it and call this our Apollo 13 moment. You guys all remember the movie and remember that circumstance where, you know, you have people together moving through space on a common craft. We're just on a little bit bigger craft. And our lives and safety are threatened by a problem we have to solve, which in that case, as now, is too much carbon in that atmosphere. And the clock is ticking. We have a very limited amount of time. In that case, as now, we have the tools that we need to solve the problem. We just need to actually commit to doing them. So let's commit together to use those tools today, because failure really isn't an option. Let's tilt for windmills, for solar panels, and for all the other clean technologies that will give us a shot at a cleaner and better future. Thank you. So I think what we're going to do now is, Chris, as I said, was going to talk to you about a very specific thing that you can engage on here on Cape Cod. And then Brian was going to help moderate some questions. That sound good? Okay, great. Chris.
Thanks, Russ. Hey, folks. Can you hear me? Yes. Great. So thanks very much. Chris Powicki. I live in Brewster, and I'm chair of the Cape Cod group of the Sierra Club. As Ross mentioned, we're working here in parallel with our friends and colleagues at the state level and also at the national level. I think that's another thing that's really unique and important about Sierra Club, is what happens locally makes a national difference, and what happens nationally makes a local difference. And we're working in both directions on that. So I wanted to talk about something specific to tilting for windmills that we have a chance as a region to work on. Over the next couple months, we have the opportunity to take decisive climate action and to address historic inequities by helping make affordable offshore wind power available to all electricity consumers on Cape Cod. As of yesterday, steel and a stake is finally in the ground off the Cape in the form of the first offshore wind turbine component to be installed in local waters. Vineyard Wind, an 800-megawatt project, will begin supplying renewable energy to Cape Cod, to the Cape Cod grid and to Massachusetts consumers before the end of this year. By January 2024, within about 6 months, Vineyard Wind and other companies that have leased wind resource areas south of Cape Cod must submit bids in a competitive auction for 3,600 megawatts of additional offshore wind capacity. The winning bidders will receive the utility power purchase agreements they need to secure financing for the next round of offshore wind projects to be built. Developers are actively seeking for an edge in the bidding process, such as by offering community benefits to host communities on the Cape and Vineyard. And they also hope to leverage investments in their winning bids by finding buyers for additional wind turbine capacity. Conveniently, based on the leadership of our Senator, Julian Cyr, and our state representative, Sarah Peake, state law enacted in 2022 allows individual towns and municipal aggregations like the Cape Light Compact to negotiate long-term power purchase agreements with offshore wind developers with a financial backstop provided by the state. The compact was formed based on town meeting votes, and it's governed by appointed representatives from each Cape and Vineyard community. These individuals represent you and your interests as energy consumers, which thankfully include protecting and preserving the Earth's climate, ecosystems, and inhabitants. While the compact offers excellent efficiency programs, the compact's current electricity supply mix, like that of almost every other entity in New England, is based largely on system power, which is based on methane gas, which is fracked when it's removed from underground. And that's why our current prices are the highest ever, because of our reliance on natural gas. The upcoming state procurement creates a once-in-a-generation opportunity to apply the compact's buying power in committing to a decarbonization pathway that is aligned with state and global goals. Making non-polluting offshore wind energy accessible to all will also deliver rate stability and resiliency to market disruptions like a pandemic, the war in Ukraine, hurricanes, and things like that tend to send our fossil fuel prices spiking. Earlier this year, Sierra Cape Cod urged the compact's governing board to commit to this path and to open up negotiations with offshore wind developers. Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey has called for 100% renewable electricity by 2030 as a critical step in achieving the state goal of net zero emissions by 2050. Getting the Cape Light Compact to agree to a long-term agreement for offshore wind capacity coming online by 2030 would position the Cape as a leader in harnessing renewable energy, buying renewable energy, and using renewable energy, all at the same time. And this would all be done at the speed and the scale needed for decarbonization. We could meet all of our electricity needs with offshore wind, backed by energy storage and other technologies. So the next step that's needed is to engage advocates like you in conversations with your community's Cape Light Compact representative. And if you're interested in joining this Sierra Cape Cod campaign, there's a sign-up sheet at the back of the room for our mailing list. Sierra Cape Cod meets twice a month, and we'd love to have you at the table. And also, we're planning to pursue this campaign, and we'll be doing training and other things to try to push this idea forward. We do have a great opportunity to do something unique, and hope you will join us. And so thanks for the opportunity to speak today. Thanks very much again to Ross for his presentation, and to Reverend McGurk, and to the Faith Communities Environmental Network for having me today. And so I guess we're open for questions.
If you have a question, please come forward and speak it into this mic. One thing I'd like to also announce is this is being recorded, and you'll be able to view the entire seminar on our website, St. Christopher's website. I don't know the address or whatever it is. Yep. All right, so questions. Come on up. Extroverts, come on.
Oh, John. Now I'm nervous.
I'm going to have to stoop over to Ross, you talked about the role of the ocean and the energy that it absorbs. One of the issues I think locally here is the issue of the trees and how they roll, the role that they play. And I wondered, do you have any, does the Sierra Club or any other organization have any model bylaws that would relate to protecting trees? Because here, for example, if you are a contractor, you don't have to go to the planning board in order to strip that lot line to lot line. You can cut down every tree. Then you go to the planning board. That seems like it's in reverse. You know, if we're going to protect our forests, we have to be able to do that. The second question is, you didn't mention carbon recapture. Is that something that's so blue sky that it's not really going to be anything useful in the next 20, 30 years? Or I know there are pilot projects in Scandinavia that they're working on it. Are those also something you could help us out?
Yeah, thanks. So on the first point, let me just step back and say Sierra Club actually did do a big policy a couple years ago where we've always focused our climate work on stopping fossil fuel pollution, stopping the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, recognize the importance of that. And frankly, for a number of years, people were concerned about focusing on adaptation and resilience and natural solutions because they were worried that that would give people a sense that, oh, maybe all you have to do is protect trees or protect trees or plant new trees or, you know, do other actions, or we can solve all this with adaptation measures. And we've decided to move beyond that. We recognize that the crisis is happening now, that we're going to need to both work as rapidly as we can to transition things away from fossil fuels and promote natural solutions, including trees. So we adopted a big policy on that. I don't know, frankly, about model ordinances. That's something I can look into. And John, you know how to find me, so I will follow up on that. You know, I will say that I think it's important to look at that, although sometimes the onus is put, I think, unfairly on new development. Sometimes is needed for housing, for urban infill, and other things. There was a study done in Seattle, for example, recently, which looked at the causes of tree loss in the city and found that most of the trees that were being lost were actually in parks or open spaces where we had old trees that weren't being adequately maintained or that were planted the wrong places or other things like that. So I think it requires a holistic approach. And, you know, we need to really be, I'll say another thing that Sierra Club's been working hard on is ensuring open space for everybody, not just protecting those big areas in the wilderness or, you know, critical iconic spots, which we still are going to be working hard on, but also ensuring that there's outdoor access for everybody. And that every person living in, for example, urban areas should be able to be in walking distance of a place where they can take their kids or walk their dog, and agree that trees are really important. Your other question, carbon capture. So I'm going to make sure right now, I should have said at the beginning that even though I'm the director and vice president for Sierra Club, I was speaking today as an individual. I think what I was saying was mostly consistent. Chris can check me if I said anything over there, but I'm speaking as an individual. When I talk about carbon capture, I'm going to be even going beyond policies we have now. There's two things that often get confused. One is capturing carbon from existing fossil fuel facilities. That's something that we believe is an important technology to, you know, frankly, EPA should be requiring all coal plants and other generating facilities to put it on. Not so much because we think they're going to do it, but because they think they should be, it is available and they should be addressing their harms. But then I assume what you're talking about, John, is the technology of what's sometimes called direct air capture. There's a number of facilities out there in the world, including one that I had a chance to tour up in Canada, another one in Switzerland, that have developed working technology where you can suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And the cost for that, while still significantly higher than being competitive without major price supports, is getting there. And then when you pull the carbon out, you can either put it into the ground in ways that sequester it, or you can potentially use it for hard to decarbonize sectors. Like I'm actually going to have an article coming out in Sierra Magazine online next week talking about the aviation challenge and some of the solutions that are most exciting there for all of us who, do like to visit our relatives on Cape Cod or do like to take trips, but are very concerned about our carbon footprint and don't want to just be buying offsets. And one of the most exciting things that's happening there is ways that people can actually take carbon from the atmosphere, combine it with the hydrogen that you can develop from windmills and solar power by using electrolysis and create fuels. That's actually something you can do right now. Prices are still higher than other alternatives, but it's getting there quickly. And I will say that most studies of a net zero future, when you account for some of those difficult to decarbonize sectors, include basically electrifying everything, we talked about that, making sure that all those electrons are coming from clean renewable energy, we talked about that, but also then using some solutions that aren't quite ready for prime time to get us that last 5 or 10% of the way there. And that's probably going to include a combination of natural solutions like protecting and enhancing our forests and marine ecosystems, but also it's going to include things like direct air capture. Others? Or we can all go to the reception and talk there. John has more. No, somebody better get in line after John.
I don't want to miss the opportunity while we've got you cornered. In France, my younger brother lives in France, and he touts the fact that France basically depends entirely on its nuclear energy generation. And I wondered, where does the Sierra Club come out on that, and where do you personally come out on using nuclear energy as a part of our future?
Well, I'm glad you asked it as a two-part question. Where Sierra Club comes out on that is, someone said it from the audience, no. Sierra Club is strongly anti-nuclear, and that's a stance that we've had for a long time. I will say that we've had some activists, some climate activists and others who from time to time asked us whether we should maybe reopen that discussion because of the need to have low carbon solutions for the climate crisis. And my answer permanently is that I don't see a reason to do that for the simple reason that no one is building nuclear power now without massive subsidies and without having the costs related to nuclear power, like the still unsolved issue of how you're going to dispose of that waste, being underwritten by the government. So just to give you a couple examples, there were 2 major nuclear power projects that were being built in the United States in the last decade. One in South Carolina that finally collapsed, actually involving the bankruptcy of an iconic industrial company, Westinghouse, because they got caught up in it. And with around, I think, $9 billion being spent, and the project not being completed, and the ratepayers are having to pay for that. There's a project that's being completed in Georgia that came in at about $12 billion, was originally estimated for $3 billion. And it's not just the United States. Finland had a similar example. They just recently finished a nuclear power plant at the 3-4x what was expected. There are folks working hard on potential technologies that they think will make it cheaper. None of us are convinced that's actually going to happen. I spoke at a fusion conference recently, and God bless, I hope that the people proposing fusion are going to bring it to completion. They're smarter than me, and they're working on some great things, and fusion may have the prospect of bringing that along. And there's other great technologies out there, but existing nuclear technologies are just not a place that we should be putting our bet. I guess the only final thing I'd say on that is it's too slow. We need to cut carbon in the next 7 years and then cut it more. We need to have technologies that we can implement now. And any money we pour into that is a huge distraction from the deployment that we can be doing today of wind, of solar, of energy efficiency, of other kinds of technologies that will make a real difference in the world we live in today. There's
Thank you so much, Russ. I'm Susan Starkey with Brian.
Oh, thank you, Susan. Yeah, I've heard so much about your great group.
Yes. Well, our Faith Communities Environmental Group joins with the Wampanoag and others that says that we really first need to do no more harm. We've done plenty, and for me, I spent a number of decades in Denver where we were told the best path forward is with natural gas. It's so clean, it's so wonderful. Didn't turn out to be the right choice that we made at that time. Now we're calling things clean energy when offshore wind, which I totally support, as well as solar, but they're not made out of clean energy materials. And I'm mostly concerned with and curious about what we can do around it. We say, well, trade-offs are necessary. So yeah, we've got to mine all these minerals because we've got to have battery storage, otherwise it won't be affordable and all of that. And my heart really hurts to think that we've got to just have a whole new industry. So now instead of natural gas, it's going to be mining minerals. And so have you struggled with that one too, and where do you come out on it? Because it's not so simple as it's not a
No.
all or nothing.
No, thank you. And thank you for all the work that you and others in the Faith Community Environmental Network are doing. It's really inspirational. Yeah, no, that's an issue that we struggle with all the time, and Sierra Club members and our allies and environmental justice partners struggle with all the time. And look, we need to be evaluating and trying to minimize the impacts of the technologies we're using, while recognizing, again, the issues of speed and scale of what we need. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the absolutely necessary. Not just the good, but the absolutely necessary. We, don't have the ability to just look at our navels or sit in caves and do no harm. I mean, obviously we can do that as individuals and try to minimize our impacts on the earth, but we need to be transforming these huge systems, and including, most importantly, the energy that we all use. So, the thing that I'm excited about is that I see a lot of progress in those areas. A friend of mine who used to actually be one of our key leaders on staff at Sierra Club is now co-founded a company to work on recycling of solar panels, and is working with the solar panel developers who want that kind of solution in place. Will it be perfect? Of course not, but it's a way of being able to minimize the new minerals that you need, the new raw materials that you need, and ensure that you can be bringing things back in. On the battery side, there will be mining, and there are impacts associated with any mining. The extraction related to rare earth materials is far, far smaller, and the environmental harm, frankly, associated with that is far, far smaller than what's happening for the fuels that are being pulled out of the ground every day, whether oil and gas, with the fracking impacts and the pipeline impacts, and let alone the kind of impacts you see in places like the Niger Delta, where whole communities and the ecosystems are being destroyed, or mountaintop mining for coal. Now, that is not at all to excuse the kind of harms that can happen, especially in other places in the world, where people are being exploited, where children are being forced to work, where there can be, brutal governments and slave labor being employed to pull all sorts of minerals out of the ground, whether these kind of precious or so-called rare earth minerals or things like diamonds and gold and other materials, which is one of the reasons that Sierra Club also recognizes that we need to be ensuring mining happening in the United States is being done sustainably and is being done with the consent and with the ways that benefit, for example, tribal communities, as opposed to the old-fashioned colonial means, but that we should be encouraging more of it to be happening here as opposed to just saying, oh, we're going to assume that nothing is, if we don't see it and it's just coming in from abroad, whether, slave labor someplace or children being put to work or huge mortality there. So those are all things that we need to do. The final thing I'll say is that, again, I'm excited by the new technology that's coming along. Again, we need to deploy what we have now, whether it's for these batteries that are going to do this or for the kind of things we all rely. Actually, far more of those rare earth materials are used in these things and in our computers and internet and other things than they're currently used in clean technologies. So we need to deploy those things now, but I'm excited that there's a lot of really great research about different kinds of battery technologies, about different ways of doing things, and people are getting more efficient all the time. I'm no expert, and so don't claim to be the scientist, but I just get excited by the progress that I see. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, could you talk about some of the storage technologies and new technologies, or will that take up too much time?
The question was, can I talk about the storage technologies and new technologies, or will that take too much time? It won't take too much time because I don't, again, have a lot of the expertise on it. For most of the energy storage being done now is something called pump storage, where you're moving water up a hill when electricity is really cheap and then allowing it to come back down the hill. If done well, that can be a really good technology, but for those of us who are old enough to remember the Storm King project on the Hudson River in New York, there are times where people want to do it at massive scale. Or I mentioned the project in my home state of Washington where a developer wanted to put it on sacred tribal land and wasn't doing any kind of good outreach before they decided that was the place. And so, those kind of impacts are important. Most of the battery technology now is the lithium ion technology, the same kind of thing we use in our smartphones and electric vehicles. But there's a lot of potentially exciting developments for different kinds of technologies that would probably be less polluting and involve less use of that for those large-scale needs that we have for the grid. They're probably not going to scale for, at least immediately, for something that's small enough to put in your pocket. From what I hear from folks who know is that lithium ion has some significant advantages for that. But it's important to be watching that. Final thing I'll say is that energy storage is going to be really important, as is transmission, because we have to have a 24/7 clean energy economy. The thing that our opponents always love to say is, well, the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. And we go, people have figured that out. It's, they're not dumb. And we're seeing places where we're actually getting either to or very close to 100% clean energy by coupling these things together and allowing us to, take wind energy from one place and solar energy from another, connect that with transmission, use storage to fill in the gaps. I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities where, for example, we can be taking the EVs that we drive and then making sure they're plugged in and having computers in the EVs allowing you to say, do you want to get incentivized by your utility to feed power back to the grid during the times it really needs it? And then you can charge at a time the grid doesn't need it. That's the kind of thing that's going to be really exciting. Dar, do we still have time?
Last question.
Last question.
So when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, it was reported that it was like really good news and a big deal for clean energy and potentially climate change. And like I'm looking and I'm wondering and I'm like, how? I want to know what the impact is, when it's coming, what we can expect from this act. I know, I don't feel like I've seen it yet, but I'm wondering when you think, what will happen, when it will come, and what we can kind of look for.
Well, it's happening now. I mentioned the Wall Street Journal estimate of $3 trillion in investments coming in, largely unlocked by the Inflation Reduction Act. And what's been happening just in the last year is really a remarkable re-onshoring of industry to the United States. The Inflation Reduction Act was obviously climate policy, but at its heart, it was industrial policy. It was a policy that said, we're going to be creating incentives for people to be building things here, which is something that we know didn't happen for many years, and we saw a hollowing out of so many different communities. So you look at Georgia, where I think there was $3 billion energy storage facility, as well as some billion-dollar-plus EV factories that have been announced. I've seen, and I'm happy to share with you, a lot of articles about just these different announcements that are happening all the time, whether it's with offshore wind, the kind of shoreside facilities that are needed for those projects. Again, the Boone's, my nephew Boone, who I mentioned, is working on one of those right now in New York. You're seeing those happening all around the country. And frankly, I think all of us need to be doing a better job of bringing those together and telling the story of those. One final plug for Sierra Club. We're putting in a great program to take advantage of the fact that we've got chapters, volunteers, and staff in all 50 states. And one of the biggest priorities that we're working on now is ensuring that those staff and volunteers are getting the information that we can be sharing with the communities on what are the policies that are most important in those states, what are the incentives and investment opportunities that are coming, and how they can apply for these grants or tax incentives or other projects, because like any other federal program, it often can get really, really confusing. But, I'm excited, it's real, and it's happening, and we need to be doing a better job of getting the good news out about that.
Well, you've certainly done that. I guess we all come here asking ourselves, is there hope in the face of this existential crisis? And I think one way to answer it is to sort of look around and to see people like Ross doing the work that they're doing with the kind of talents and energy and commitment and will that he and Chris and others in this room are applying to it. And that gives me great hope, because it's going to come from us. So I think Ross and Chris are inspirations to each of us, that we all have agency. We can all do something. So let's give Ross and Chris a round of applause.
Back at you.
Thank you for coming, and there's refreshments down there, and I think Ross's battery's got to be close to empty, but he'll be down there too. Thank you.